Start. I think I'm a bit late already, so I'm gonna try and not go over time. Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Maria Comas. I work at Mazy Labs based in Zurich, and today I wanted to talk about GraphQL. So GraphQL, in the last few years, it's been picking up more and more interest. We can see here, this is the survey for the state of JavaScript from last year. We can see that more of 90% either had heard of it and wanted to learn about it, or had already used it and would use again. So what is GraphQL? Maybe let's start with some background history. It was developed by Facebook back in 2012, and then 3 years after that, they decided to open source it. Then last year, 2018, there was the GraphQL Foundation, who was funded, and what they want to do is to provide this open and neutral space so GraphQL can be further developed and more people start using it. But what is GraphQL? So in essence, what GraphQL is this long document. It's like 160 pages long. And what it does is it specifies this data querying language that GraphQL is. So it says how client could request data and how a GraphQL server is going to behave to structure that data and to eventually return it. So GraphQL is this kind of layer that sits in between the backend and the frontend. And the beauty of it is that in the backend you can have many different sources, and they can have many different types. You can have a database, or you can have data that you need to request from a third-party API. You can have just a file that you might want to request information from. And GraphQL abstracts all of that complexity, and it provides this unified interface that then the clients can query. So the client can also be, it can only be one, it can be several. You can have a mobile web application, you can have a mobile native application, whatever. As long as they can send a GraphQL query over to the server, they'll be able to get the data they need from it. So that is important, right? That the system gets this unified interface that makes sense for all of these pieces and that makes the pieces work together more easily. But in his talk in the GraphQL Summit last year, Garrett Heinlein, he works at Netflix, he said that what convinced him the most, that he was a bit skeptical of it at first, but then he is now a big enthusiast. And what he likes the most is that the way GraphQL transformed the way the teams work together. So the front-end team and the back-end team, he saw that it drastically improved the way they work together. And so GraphQL, it becomes this kind of interface for humans as well, because it makes it makes everybody talk and have that conversation. Because the data, it does need to be defined, how you structure it and how you can shape it. So you need everyone talking about it and how to implement it. So it's that conversation that it gets started thanks to having this central, reliable, consistent definition of what the data that project has is. And in my head, it's kind of pattern love for the front end. We've seen that there are more and more tools to have a library of UI components, and that gives everyone like a shared knowledge and language to talk about them, to see what the needs are, and to evolve that in time, to use the same words to talk about the same things. So this is kind of what GraphQL can do for data. And we've already seen what advantages GraphQL might have, this flexibility and this having people work together more easily. But maybe let's go back to why Facebook implemented it in the first place. They saw that because more and more people were using their phones to access Facebook, they needed a very efficient way to manage data. And the available options were not good enough for that. But at the same time, because it's very complex on the people aspect too, they needed people to be able to use it and learn about it very easily. And that's what they set out to do. And it was not only them. At the same time, Coursera and Netflix were developing similar solutions. Netflix, I think they even released their solution, and it's called Falcor, but they are both using GraphQL now. So how did they manage to get this new API that would be very powerful, but at the same time very easy to learn? So there are some principles that the Facebook team kept in mind as they were designing it, and a few of them, I like to call them wikis WAF, which is what you get is what you ask for. And the gist of it is that you get exactly what you need, no more, no less, and that it really plays well with the way the view is structured. So the client, the product, kind of drives the way that data is structured. GitHub has a very cool public GraphQL API that you can play with. So let's imagine for a second that we want to implement this profile page for a GitHub user. We have all this data that we need to display, and it's structured in a way, it has a hierarchy, and it can change over time. Maybe they develop a new feature that they want to add here to the profile page. But let's now focus on just this part of it. So what do we have here? We have an image, we have the username, they have the login that they use, they have maybe where they work, where they are located, and their website. So if you were to ask for that information as a human to somebody, you would say, well, for this specific user, what I need is a URL for the image so I can display it, their avatar, I want to know their name, I want to know their website, and all of that information. So that's what the GraphQL query would look like, which is kind of exactly what I just said. You need a specific user, and for that you use an argument. We don't need to get into that, but you can specify which user you need information from, and then you have the fields, exactly the fields that you need. So if you want to send that query to the server, what are you going to get in return? In this case, this is using the public GraphQL API, so it's real data, and you can go and play with it. You can get your own information, you can even start repos from it. But yeah, going back to this response, we see that it has the exact same shape that the query had. So you can work with that very easily. You know exactly what the server is going to return, what shape it is going to have, and it's so predictable that it's very easy for the client to work with that. But maybe let's make it a bit more complex. We also want to display who that user, Leah in this case, is following. And we see here that the first person that she's following is George. How would we go about querying about that? This is the original query that we had with the fields that we needed, and then we can add this new one, this following. In this case, we limit the result to only provide the first person that she's following. And then for that, we also need to know what their avatar is, what their name is, login, etc. And the response, as you can imagine, it's very similar to what we had before, but it includes this nested user in it. And you can imagine that from that we could keep going. We could also want to know, and that person that Leah's following, who is he following? And then just keep querying the database for, the data for any information that we need. So that's an important aspect of it, that for the client it's very easy to describe what data they need and to get it, exactly that, no more, no less. But then also another aspect that is awesome about GraphQL is that it is strongly typed. And what that means is that it makes it very easy for tools like this to exist. This is GraphQL. This is a NIM browser environment to develop that you can use, and this is also open source, so it is quite easy to add that to your project. This one here is the one from GitHub that they have, from which you can play around. You can see in the left we have the query that we used before. In the middle we have the response that the server gives to us, and in the right it's the documentation. So because it is strongly typed and it is introspective, you can explore what a specific GraphQL schema is like. And you can do that without being familiar with that schema, or without being familiar with GraphQL even. Because the fact that it is typed, it makes it very predictable, so the tools, your IDE or whatever, they can make sure that the query that you are writing is valid, and that you only request information that it is there in the first place. So on the left, for the query, we can see that there is this kind of model that gives you auto-completion, and it tells you all the fields that you can query from that point in the query. You get that by typing command space. In the right, you can also browse and explore that API very easily. You can see which fields that type implements. You can see description for them. You can see each field, the type for the specific field. And you can get familiar with any API very easily. You can even query the server with a query. Like in this case, we are asking for the type of this user and also the people that she follows in this case. So we can see that it is a user. You could ask for all the types that schema defines and get familiar with the API that way. So we've already seen what the query could look like, and we can have a hint of how the server implements all these types, so we can easily get the response that we need. But let's go through another example. This example here is from that article linked down there. It's a very, very good article about the basics of a GraphQL server. And what it explains is that in the client, we can use this query, which is asking for the ID and the name of that specific user. But on the server, what do we need? We need two things, right? For the data, we need to describe how it's structured, and that would be a collection of all the types that you're going to have. In this case, we need two types. We need the query type and the user type. The query type is a bit special because it defines the entry point for your API. It could also be a mutation type, a mutation that's another special root field, and that one would be for writing instead of reading. But for this case, what we need is this first root type, which we call query, and has only one field here, which is the user. The user accepts an argument, which is an ID of type ID, and in this case it is required, and we know that because it has an exclamation mark. And it will return a user. What is a user? So a type user, it has an ID, which is required, and then a name, which would be a string. But that's not enough, because that is defining how the data is structured, but we eventually want to get that data. So how do we do that? So in the beginning, I said that GraphQL is this document, it's a specification, and that means that it's very flexible. It doesn't care how your data is stored or how it is transported to your client. It doesn't care what your client is. It doesn't care about what the server in which programming language is written. It doesn't care about a lot of things. But there is an implementation of a GraphQL server done by Facebook, which is written in JavaScript, and it's kind of a reference for other libraries as well. And this would be an example of using that JavaScript implementation. And it's very naive, but we can see already that the type that we defined before, which was the query type, we can see, we are saying it has this field, which is user, some information about that field, and we also define how to get that data. So that would be a resolver function. And a resolver function, it gives that flexibility to GraphQL because it's arbitrary code. It can be anything. You can return a random string, or you can return information that you grab from an external source or from your database. It can be anything. So that's what makes it be so flexible. Then in the future, if you change your data source, the client doesn't care. The client knows how to ask for that data, and it is up for the resolver function to change maybe the implementation and say, instead of returning that random string, I want to get it from that other source. And in this case, it's calling a function that will return that information, but we can also see that for the user type that we also defined, it will be very straightforward because these resolver functions, they get the response from the parent. They get the value from the parent. So the user field would get the user object, and because the user object already contains the information that we want, which is the name and the ID, it can already return it just like that. So this is all cool, but can we use it with Drupal? Yes, there is the GraphQL module that is like the main module, and then there are some related modules. And what that module does, if you use the third version number 3, and you install it, you enable the core module, what that does is it creates the schema, and it has the resolvers that you need to query all of your content entities plus some extra stuff. If you need your menus, blocks, image styles, it already creates the resolvers to get all of that. But because that is not, we were saying that the front end and the back end have those conversations about what the schema should look like and that it can evolve in time, and yeah, and that you can change the backend at any time. But in this case, if we're using a Drupal backend and the schema is so closely tied to how Drupal models content and what the database looks like, it uses entities, bundles, and all these concepts that are specific to Drupal, you wouldn't be really able to drop Drupal and use another source for all that data. So that's what the version 4 is for. It's not completely ready, but it is being used, and yeah, it is actively worked on. So if you are interested on that, maybe check it out. There's this, for the version 3, there is some documentation that you can access in the GitHub repo for GraphQL. For version 4, there's not a lot of information yet, but you can, well, I'll have a link after that. You can go to the Drupal Slack and then ask in the GraphQL channel if you have any issues with that. Another module that has to do with GraphQL in Drupal is GraphQL Tweak. So if you have a project that is not decoupled and you use the Tweak as template engine as Drupal 8 does, you can use this module. And it provides you with a way to have your queries inside your Tweak templates directly, just like that. And then you can use the information in that template and you effectively override what the render would be. If you are interested in that, there's a blog post that I added the link to, and it contains links to 2 webinars that Philip Mellap, he is the Drupal GraphQL module maintainer together with Sebastian Simpson. He gave these 2 webinars, and there's also a link to the example repo that he created with a project that uses GraphQL Tweak. So yeah, as I said, if you have any information, an easy way to get answers is to go to Drupal Slack and go to the GraphQL channel and ask there. Let me check how I'm doing time. Yeah, we'll be fine. There's a lot of resources because, yeah, as we said, GraphQL is this hot topic many people seem to be interested in. So these are 4 resources that you might want to check out. First one is How to GraphQL. It's an amazing tutorial that it dives you through the basics, and you can do some hands-on exploration. It also has information about how different clients are implementing it and how different server tools are using it. So check that out if you're interested. Then there's the principles, GraphQL.com. This is done by the Apollo people. Apollo is like this giant ecosystem which has many tools that play very well with GraphQL. And then there's the Explorer. That's what I've been using for the examples before. You can go there, you have to identify yourself, and then you can just start exploring and see what GitHub gives you. And yeah, as I said, you can even, because it's using real production data, you can even change who you're following from that. And then the last one is a book. It is accessible, freely accessible. It's written by Robin Vieruch. I hope I didn't destroy his name too much. It's very interesting. It looks at the client side and the server side part of things, and yeah, I would also recommend that. And before I finish, because today is the International Women's Day, and it is also quite fitting for the topic, I feel like, I wanted to finish with this quote by Grace Hopper, which is kind of encourages us to, don't be too afraid of changes and do the things the way they make more sense, and it doesn't matter if that's not how it's been always done. With that, thank you very much. We're out of time, so if anybody wants to chat, I'll give on.